Hi, and welcome to part 2 of Raising a Generation with Resilient Faith. I'm Cheri Fletcher, and I'm going to be continuing our discussion today with Dr. Jolene Erlacher of Leading Tomorrow Ministries. Dr. Erlacher is an intergenerational researcher, speaker, consultant, and author of the book Daniel Generation: Godly Leadership in an Ungodly Culture. If you missed part 1, you can find that on my YouTube channel. And the links to Dr. Erlacher's website and her Facebook, as well as links to my website and Facebook page, will be in the show notes. We hope that you are blessed by part 2. If you have any questions, you can again find our information on the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. And we thank you for joining. So this is part 2 of Raising a Generation in Resilient Faith with Dr. Jolene Erlacher. And in part 2, we're going to be taking a look into why our kids have to understand the why in the choices that they're making. I know I have often asked my kids why they made certain choices, and a lot of times I get the shoulder shrug with the I don't know. And we cannot actually refine behaviors. We can't refine our responses or our reactions if we don't have a clear understanding as to why we're making those decisions. So that's what we're going to be talking about in part 2. But first, we're going to just kind of briefly review a little bit of part 1 where we left off. And we were discussing raising kids among today's Babylon. And Jolene made reference to a Christian ghetto, which you can make a little bit of reference back into that. We looked at Philippians 2:15, where we were told to be a light among them. And our kids need to understand and know the culture that they're engaging in order to actually be a light among it. And so we have to understand the culture in order to serve it. And we have to be able to be the light, but in it, but not or among it, but not of it, if that makes sense. So if you will, Dr. Erlacher, just recap shortly a little bit about what that discussion was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like to use the analogy of Daniel, who was born and grew up in Judah, but suddenly found himself in Babylon, having to figure out how to live a life of faith there. And that's often what I see our kids today, our young adults, having to navigate. The world has changed dramatically in the last 10 or 20 years, and we're seeing it, of course, right now changing even more. That our kids, the worldviews, the values, the technologies that are available to them, all these things are creating a very different context in which they're having to live out their faith. And so this can be a little bit of a struggle, and it's leading to some of the need for this why. In the past, when culture was somewhat stable, we kind of knew the whys. We intuitively understood them. But today, that's not always the case, because what we did in Judah doesn't always translate to Babylon. What we did 20 years ago isn't always translating well to where our students are at today. So for Gen Z, really college students and younger, their highest moral value today is tolerance. And tolerance is being defined as not just understanding and respecting others, which is our traditional definition, but also affirming and accepting every point of view as equal. So this pluralistic, relativistic society that we live in is really creating an entirely different context. And sometimes the things that we say traditionally in our faith traditions are not translating well into the culture today that our young people are growing up in. So this is really contributing to that need for helping them process the why so they can own their faith. We also know that about 4% of Gen Z has a biblical worldview, as compared to 10% of baby boomers, right? Or 9% of Gen X. So there's fewer of them to be able to even process with together. And there's really this need for godly mentors and coaches to help them along the way.
Oops. I love how you mentioned that we need the godly mentors. I read through a book, Faith for Exiles, that is by David Kinnaman and Matt Marklet, who they are doing a lot of statistics. That's their business. And they were saying that in that book, we have no mentors. A lot of kids don't feel that there is someone in their church community that they really can go to. And it's just so important to be one. Yeah. And to put our kids where they can have access to them. And, raising our kids in a faith-based home how are we able to really, grow this Daniel generation that we need so desperately? I mean, we put them in Christian schools, or we homeschool. If they're in public school, we get them in Young Life, and we try, put them in these activities. Yet there is still such a large amount of our youth who are not actively participating in church life once they get out on their own. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's interesting because the number one predictive factor as to whether or not a young person will retain their faith as they enter young adulthood is if they have a godly mentor, a Christian mentor, somebody who has invested in their life. The thing is, today, young people are inundated with information. In 1 year, we are now producing as much data as we had produced in the whole history of the world before. So young people are just getting information, so much information all the time, that just telling them, just being in a program or in a Bible class or in a, Sunday, Sabbath school or whatever it is that they're doing to receive the word is not enough. They have to actually process it in order to internalize it. So that's where they have to understand the why. Part of what's beating this is that we've kind of come through a period of deconstruction. That's part of the cultural shift that's happened, where young people have been taught to deconstruct things and find what's not working. Right? And so they've been taught that what's responsible, and this is not necessarily overt, but even when I listen to like the cartoons my kids are listening to, I hear these messages that it is responsible to ask why, to understand what's working, what's not working, and to engage in things that are going to be helpful or beneficial. However, asking why often comes across as disrespectful to the older generation, right? Because we were taught to kind of follow orders. So this is one of the cultural gaps that is occurring right now, where young people desperately need to ask why. They view it as responsible, and it helps them own the information that they know to be true in light of all the information that they're hearing. But often adults are not inviting their whys because we view them as disrespectful. Here's the thing. Our kids today know that information is available to them. They can access information. They're going to access information. They're going to answer their whys. The question is, who's going to answer them? We touched on this a little bit in part one. Who's going to answer it for them? And too often, parents, leaders, mentors, teachers we're not answering the questions that they're asking in the church or in our homes or in our classrooms. We're giving them the information we want them to have. But young people are expert sifters. They have so much information coming at them, but they are just picking the information that's relevant to them right now. It's why if you want a kid to help you change a tire or fix a sink, they're going to say, I'll just YouTube that if I need to do it. They know the information's out there when they need it. Why would I spend time right now getting information that I don't need right now? So if we are willing to answer the whys that they're asking at any given moment, it really gives us an opportunity to mentor them in a really profound way.
Oh, I really like that. Because even, now, hindsight 2020 in parenting, I'm realizing of the things that I actually, I was too busy and stopping to answer that why or teach at that moment, and so I have kids that are probably in some ways going to have to YouTube things. I've even made funny videos of mom's going to cut some carrots now, and this is how I'm going to do it, and send it to them because I didn't, that was too busy to do it at the time.
Yes.
So our kids are making decisions right now without having, we talked about this in part one, not having a strategic plan. They're just making reactive decisions without even thinking about the result of the decision. We also have kids, or, and we're in an era where we can delete. And so a lot of times the consequences, they don't think long-term what they might be. We live in a culture that loudly tells this generation that, morality is based on what feels right. And how does that play into integrity?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've moved from the modern era into whatever this new era is. We call it postmodern for now. But we've moved from making decisions based on facts, logic, and reason to making decisions based on emotion, story, and experience. And that is very much impacting how young people approach the world. Now, because they're being told, be true to yourself, be true to what you feel, and your identity is fluid. Today you might feel one thing, tomorrow another, and then that's okay. So these are the messages that they're getting. One thing I just like to hold out as a piece of hope is that Jesus told stories and gave people experiences and engaged them in the reality of what they were living. So God can speak to and guide us through our emotions and our stories and our experiences. So that's hopeful. But you're right, they're not experiencing consequences. So they're not often seeing the logical result of something. Sometimes as parents, we're at fault for this. I've just been really challenged, even when I have my kids are struggling with something, a sport or an activity. I want to swoop in and rescue them. We put knee pads on them and helmets and all these stuff, which are good. But when they fall off the bike, they're not realizing, oh, I get a scraped knee. That's the consequence. So in little ways, we're stripping the consequences. When our kids fail a test, instead of letting them realize, your GPA is going to take a hit and that might affect your college, we insist on them getting a chance to retake it. We are not allowing them. What does it matter? What does a point, a point on your GPA matter in comparison to the life experience of learning? So really, as parents, we have to be really careful that we're not stripping them. Sometimes this lawnmower helicopter parenting phenomena is stripping our kids of the recognition of consequences, which when they feel real consequences and have to suffer those consequences, maybe it is an unfair grade from a teacher. How do we navigate that? That then creates this opportunity to discuss integrity and what are your values and how are you going to live and respond in these situations. So I think we have to be careful of that.
Yeah. Our choices will continue to be random and unpredictable. When we use the feelings as a guide to these decisions. And one of the things I'm known for saying is your emotions have no IQ. And I hear, so if when we're making a decision that needs an IQ, really need to make sure that that we're not doing it with an emotion. And one of the things I hear a lot from parents, and then from this new generation, is from parents I hear, I just want them to be happy. And from the kids, I just need to be happy. But we all know that happy is an emotion that can be gone in 1 minute, and that not everything in life makes us happy. So then when our kids are facing a situation where they're not happy, they start thinking something's wrong with them. Either they're a failure or they made the wrong choice. This isn't right. This must not be my passion. All these things, when we're telling our kids, we just want you to be happy, we're setting them up to make reactionary decisions based on an emotion. So what are some of your suggestions to teach logic-based responses that in the long run will actually lead to happiness?
Yeah, we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, just about Matthew 7 and unpacking that, and how helping our kids process how godly principles actually give us the best life. God designed us, and so his principles, and so we have to really unpack that with kids throughout their lives as opportunities present themselves to kind of process that. I think, there's some great curriculums out there right now, apologetic curriculums. I mentioned Foundation Worldview. Your spiritual game plan, that kind of give us a context to have some of those discussions. And I understand what a strategic plan for our life looks like. So I think as parents, we can adopt some of those. I think another big piece of it is living with integrity ourselves. My 7-year-old was listening to an audiobook this week, and yesterday at dinner, she said to me, "Mommy, that person in the audiobook said that we need to love our enemies. But then when there was a bad person who was doing something bad, they fought with that person. How is that loving our enemies?" I was like, oh, okay. 7-year-old, but creating the space to have those kinds of discussions, because kids noticed inconsistency. She noticed the inconsistency in this character. You better believe our kids notice the inconsistencies in our lives, right? So living with integrity and doing what we were talking about, apologizing and confessing when we're not living with integrity, is going to be really, really good. Kids need to be able to process these things. They are, uploaders, like we talked about, Tim Elmore mentions. They learn through processing. So we have to have some of these conversations. And here's the best tool, especially for our preteens and teenagers, young adults, is not telling them the logical consequence. But it's often called the 5 whys, asking them, why did you do that? Well, because I felt like it. Well, why did you feel like it? Well, because it would make me feel better. Well, did it make you feel better? Well, yes. Why did it make you feel better? Do you think you're going to feel better about it tomorrow? I had a conversation with a 17-year-old recently, and I just kept asking her questions till she realized, okay, I don't have a good answer for this, So it's in a loving, not like an accusing or attacking way, but in a loving way, seeking to truly understand. We can't just tell them. We have to draw it out of them, help them walk through the logical thinking process, the critical thinking, to get to an answer that's going to make sense to them so that they can own it. I think that's important as well.
Yeah, that asking the questions over and over. I mean, they were little. They asked us why,
Yeah.
being able to turn it back and ask
Yes.
why.
Yes.
One of the things that I do with the kids that I work with is have them write down their non-goals. I mean, we want kids to write down your goals, but let's look at what we don't want in our future. We have to be very clear on what we don't want, because each decision that these kids are making are critical, and it's going to be either towards our goal or it's going to be towards our non-goal. And put that on the same piece of paper, side by side, your goals, your non-goals. So that it's a visual in your head, so that when you're making that decision, you're seeing, is this going to take me this direction to my non-goals? Yeah. So I always say, when you're as old as Mrs. Fletcher, where do you not want to be? Because these decisions are so critical, but a lot of times we don't really sit down. Well, we have the opportunity while we're still safe. They haven't done anything too drastic, and make them actually think, do I want to be in this area, or do I make sure I don't want to be over here? And being able to control that while we can.
Yeah.
And so I like how you're talking about, standing on the authority, being consistent, acknowledging that God is the leader, and having these mentors are just so huge in that process. So talk about the overload of information right now, because you're saying that what they are actively engaged in becomes real.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because they do have so much information, they just kind of sort it, like it kind of comes in and goes out, or just sifts past them. What becomes real that they actually comprehend and absorb is the information that they have to experience, that they engage in some way. So this is where moral values, so much of the development of moral values today, especially since they live in a cultural context where we value experience, story, and emotion, is that just telling them good moral values is not necessarily going to be effective. It's having to work them out. And one of the things I really appreciate that my parents did is sometimes they let me make bad decisions and learn the hard way, but then they were there lovingly, non-judgmentally, although with consequences, to help me process why that was not a good idea. So sometimes we can use the experience itself to help with the logic, the reasoning, if we ask the questions and help them work through it. So really, as a parent or as a teacher, as a mentor, being tuned in to the teachable moments, that's much more effective than creating a lesson plan in many cases. Like, we need to set the framework by having like some of these discussions, like the goals and the non-goals, but then being aware, being really in tune with our kids' lives, so that as things maybe are not being met, a goal's not being met, why? Let's process this, let's work through it. So really making sure that we're engaging, we're not just telling them, but we're engaging it and processing it with them.
Right. I like that, guiding through the process. One of the things that is hard for me as a parent and is actually understanding what is real to them. And you want to tend to say, that's ridiculous. Well, you've just shut them down.
Mm-hmm.
And so understanding, even if as a parent, which is you're kind of, again, I'll go to sports metaphors, you're kind of on the sidelines watching this game, so you have a good advantage, you can see, but your kid is in the game.
Yeah.
And it's real to them.
Yeah.
And so when they want to process with them, making sure you understand that what they're saying is very real.
Yeah.
And it's your opportunity to guide. I liked how Jesus had the ability to engage. I like how he would continually ask questions, which is a drawing out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if all we do, like you mentioned, is tell our youth how it's going to be and how it needs to happen, we're actually weakening their resilience on that, in that area. So again, we were talking about our morality, basing our morality on feelings. One of the popular sayings, I was talking to a couple of my teens a week ago, and she said, "I am sick of hearing you do you." You know, how do parents raise their kids to appreciate that there is a difference? We tell our kids, you're unique, you're going to do it your own way. But then how do we kind of balance that you do you mindset, because it gives them a little bit of a right to, you know, make decisions that might not be the best for them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there is value in really helping kids understand how God has designed them. I love God's design as a phrase right now, because it's not how you feel. That does not determine your identity. You know, I have identical twins, and their little personalities are so different. I have an extrovert, I have an introvert. We have, you know, we can already see some of their gifts and strengths emerging. And even at this young age, we're like affirming how God has designed them. This is how God has designed you, which means God has a purpose for you. And I think that can be a really important message to just reiterate to our kids in a variety of ways. God designed you. He has a purpose for you, because then they're not just out there flailing. It's very scary as a 16-year-old to think you get to determine who you are and you be true to you. Like, what? I don't have any idea. Deep down, even if you act like you know what's going on, you know you don't. So being able to just affirm those messages, God has designed you uniquely, and he has a purpose for you. The way he's designed you can be a really, really freeing message for our kids.
Yeah, you know, my ministry is based on Ephesians 2:10, and breaking that apart, it says that you are a masterpiece. And I have yet to know anyone that does any kind of a creation, even making a cup of coffee, without an intentional use for it. You don't just create something and say, well, I wonder what we're going to do with that. Or I wonder, you know, if you're painting, you have a vision of where that's going to go, how it's going to make the room feel. An architect has a very, very clear vision of the structure he's building. God is even more in depth than that. So he created us with every intention of knowing, like it says in Ephesians 2:10, with a plan planned ahead of time for us. And so, like you said, these kids that believe that they have to find themselves, how scary that you think that God created you, left you out and said, figure it out for yourself. And so understanding, like you said, that we've got such an intentional God. You are not an unintentional design. I love that concept. Going back to integrity under pressure. This is one thing that I'm seeing a lot of in this day and age, is how our kids and how adults are reacting under pressure. And integrity, you know, it's seldom easy, yet if we aren't letting our kids face these hardships, letting them face failure, face disappointment, by helicoptering or being, as I've heard, the mama bear, which there are times when safety, I'm not saying that we need to put safety aside, but as parents, I see such an incline in this youth of anxiety. We've got kids that have anxiety. It's so epidemic almost. And these kids are paralyzed of fear of actually getting out and launching into this world that we've protected them from. They don't understand it. And So, how can we use the story of Daniel, who's taken from home at such a young age, thrust into this culture of bullies, really, but yet is able to rise under pressure?
Mhm. Well, I think, I can't unpack the whole book right here.
we will have the book available. People will get to go to the book, but
Yes.
yeah.
But I think, kind of going back to some of the things we've already said, Daniel understood his God had a purpose, and he understood that God could use him in that purpose. And here's the thing that's so encouraging to me about Generation Z. They are so, I like to say scrappy. They're very, get in there and do it. Once they're sold into an idea, they're bought into an idea, there's no changing their mind. I have seen Gen Zers who, once they're confident in their identity and who God's called them to be and in God's purpose and his truth, once their story, their experience, their emotions match the truth of Scripture, they've experienced God, they've experienced the power of God. I mean, there is no swaying them. That's the beauty of they're being driven by the power of experiences, is that when they experience what it means to be God's child, there's no changing their minds for better or for worse. So I do think, like, again, just creating those opportunities for them to really experience God, and encouraging them in that pursuit, can be really, really powerful.
One word that comes to mind as I'm listening to you talk is conviction. I had a young gal come and say she wanted to talk to me about how she could have more self-confidence. And I said, actually, that's an oxymoron, really. Mm-hmm. I don't have confidence in myself. We're told not to lean on our own understanding. Mm-hmm. But you meet someone who's convicted, and it's just full of confidence. And that is one thing I have noticed with this generation is once they're convicted, they are resilient. They are a force. I love that getting them to the point of conviction. And one way that I see that happening is allowing them to be resourceful. Yeah. I listened to a podcast. A guy was interviewing one of the headhunters for the Fortune 500 companies, and he asked him, he's like, "What are you looking for when you're providing applicants to these Fortune 500 companies to be presidents, CEOs, CFOs? You're looking for the school, the GPA, accomplishments on their resumes." And he's like, actually, the first thing I look for is resourcefulness. If they aren't resourceful, they will not last in a company. And as we continue to make decisions for our youth, and not allow them to actually fail in that or succeed in that, robbing them of that succeeding, we are taking away their resourcefulness. And so much of Daniel was resourcefulness. Yeah. So as we close this down, what are some active steps that you think we can do as parents to raise an unshakable, resilient generation?
Mm-hmm. I think you just highlighted one important one, and that is giving them opportunities. Expecting of them what they're capable of, not trying to protect them, not trying to guard them. I mean, I have a daughter who she wants to master things the first time. And she will sit at the piano with a new song, just scream and weep her eyes out because she makes mistakes. But we have learned, just walk away, let her just sit there and scream and cry and yell as she's pounding the song out again and again. I want to rescue her. I want to say, take a break, stop. But once she masters that song, I mean, she is so proud. She will sit there and then she's all smiles. But we have to let our kids struggle. We've got to let them push against the cocoon, and discover. And that means, like, in our churches, let our kids, I mean, if a kid wants to be on a worship team, find a way to get them on the worship team. If they want to, if they have an idea for doing something on social media, let them do it. If it's a little unprofessional, a little imperfect, if they fail in some way, it becomes a learning opportunity, but they start to take ownership. God trusted Daniel. I mean, Daniel was a young man to serve the king. I mean, I think we can be pretty sure Daniel was not always doing things perfectly, right? God trusts us. So I think really giving our kids opportunities to struggle, to learn, to be resourceful, to try things out, to see what's going to work, what's not going to work, so they can gain the confidence that they need when they explode out of that cocoon.
Mm, I love that. And like we mentioned in part one, actually, we didn't mention this in part one. We mentioned it in a different thing we did together. Uh, when God gave you your kids, he knew you were going to be their parent.
Yeah.
And he trusted you. And he knew that doing that, he trusted you with your kids, knowing ahead of time the mistakes that you would make, and relying on God's grace, relying on his plan and his purpose. And I think as we can hang on to that instead of our fear of failure, and just lift each other up. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk, and for the passion that you have for this, for the youth. Like we mentioned earlier, in the show notes, you'll have links to all of the information, the book, whatnot. And we just want to thank you guys and empower you and uplift you that you're not alone, that we are a village raising the next Daniel generation. I'm going to close real quick with prayer. And our Father, we thank you again for the opportunity that we've had to come together to discuss such an important decision in raising a resilient generation for you. We ask that you'll continue to bless those that are watching this and provide the tools that they need. And we just, again, thank you for the opportunity to come together. Amen.
Amen.